Cool Christmas gift. Somebody did well.
Yeah. Well, Governor Jindal, thanks for meeting with me. You're here in Iowa. You made several trips to Iowa, for Mitt Romney. You're on the judge bus. And I'm just going to ask you the question you've probably been asked a lot since being here. Any thoughts on 2016? Are you considering running for president?
Sure, a couple of things. We are considering it, something we're thinking about, we're praying about. We won't make a decision until certainly after the November elections. We've got to focus, we got to get our governor here in Iowa, Terry, reelected. We got to get Joni into the United States Senate seat. We got to reelect Steve King. And the reality is across the country, we got a lot of important races to win. We've got 36 governor's races. We've got to take the U.S. Senate. When it comes to 2016, and we'll make our decision, again, we're thinking about it, praying about it, seeing if we can make a difference there. One of the things I sense is whoever runs, we need big change in this country. It's not about incremental change. And I mean that in both parties. I think the big divide right now is between Washington, D.C. and the rest of the country. Too often in D.C., what they tell us is you can't do those things. They tell us you can't repeal Obamacare. They tell us you can't balance the budget. You can't cut spending. You can't change the entitlement programs. You can't grow the economy. That's nonsense. And so I really, I just spoke to the convention here. I said, we need a wholesale takeover, a hostile takeover, and I think that's what the country's looking for. So whoever our candidates are in 2016, we need principled conservatives. We're talking about specific policy changes and big changes to get our country back on the right track.
Great. Recently you've talked a lot about Common Core state standards, and you were originally a supporter of Common Core, and that's something I've been writing a lot about the past 3 years. What changed your mind on Common Core?
Look, I am absolutely for the idea that we must teach our kids to high standards. I'm all for that, and we've done that, and we're doing that in Louisiana. What I'm against, and what really troubles me about Common Core, and the reason I want to get Louisiana not only out of Common Core, out of Park, out of the whole thing, we don't need a federal takeover of education. The reality is we've never had, the federal government really shouldn't have that role in education. I'm one of those that believes in Louisiana we have no state approval of curricula, we have no state approval of textbooks. As I said to the convention, I believe in trusting parents. I want the dollars to follow the child. So I want parents to decide what's the best learning environment for their student, for their child. Maybe it's a parochial school, maybe it's a Christian school, maybe it's a traditional public school or charter school, an online program, maybe it's homeschooled. We don't need a one-size-fits-all approach. Every child learns differently. My concern with Common Core is not only is it a federal government intrusion, but you know for certain once the federal government sets the standards, then the curricula, then the textbooks, everything's going to be shaped around that. Another thing that's made me very, very nervous about the federal government's involvement in education was the Department of Justice, Eric Holder, coming in and suing our state, suing me to try to stop our scholarship program. We help kids by giving them the dollars we would otherwise spend on them and letting their parents decide how to spend those dollars, whether they want to go to another school or do something different. So we've seen the overreach of the federal government. We've seen this federal government get involved. So at the end of the day, I think it really comes down to trusting parents, trusting locals. We don't need the federal government making this decision.
So, something we've seen, like in Indiana, for instance, Governor Pence signed their Common Core repeal law, and then they ended up just rebranding it. Arnie Duncan has criticized every time, like Oklahoma just repealed, South Carolina repealed. He's coming in and suddenly bashing, well, they're just dumbing down their standards then. Now suddenly federal money's possibly at risk. What is Louisiana going to, well, first of all, how are you going to get out of Common Core? Because I know there's some debate about what action you can actually take.
Well, first of all, we believe we've got the authority to do this. We try to convince our legislature to pass legislation. They wouldn't do it. We've got a school board that doesn't want us to do this. We've got a superintendent, and unfortunately, we've got a local, the state chamber of commerce and others have tried to tell us they don't want us to do it. I think as governor, we've got the power to do it, and so we're going to use our powers to do that. I made that very, very clear. Let me say this about the Federal Department of Education. This is nonsense. I think that folks that are trying to push Common Core, try to make this, and then, look, the Obama administration loves to do this. They love setting up these paper tigers. If you're not for his view of the world, then you must be for letting all these awful things happen. You see him doing it in foreign policy. You've seen him doing it in the Obamacare debate. If you're not for Obamacare, you must not care about children, which is ridiculous. There are conservative approaches that help people with pre-existing conditions that bend down the cost of health care. I would argue conservative approaches are actually more compassionate because they actually help people get better paying jobs. And so, again, they're trying to construct this false choice. You can be for rigor and high standards. I want Louisiana's kids to be the best when it comes to math and science and other subjects. I want them to be able to compete in a global economy. That doesn't mean it has to be a one-size-fits-all approach. Remember, some of these same folks from the left are the same people for decades that have been telling us, give us more money, give us more time. Nothing's getting better, by the way, and they spend more and more money. We have doubled what we spent after inflation since the 70s per student, and yet scores are flat.
Sure.
This is the group that keeps telling us, well, just give us a few more years. These kids only grow up once. They don't have a few more years. And so my response to those on the left is they've had their turn. They've had their chance.
Okay.
This isn't their first effort at this. Over and over, they have continued to screw things up. They continue to throw more money at the problem. You look at choice, it works. You look at our scholarship program, double-digit growth, 93% of the parents are happy. You look at rising academic performance. You look at charter schools. They work. New Orleans, you've got, before that, the innovations, before the hurricane, you had over 60% of kids in failing schools. Now it's less than 6%. Record high graduation rates in Louisiana.
Yeah, does Louisiana have strings attached to the scholarship money?
No.
'Cause that's something we've seen in other states, and unfortunately that's brought Common Core into some private schools.
Absolutely not. We are very clear. We are not trying, because what you don't want to do is scare off these private schools, because a lot of these private schools come to this saying, we're not changing our curricula, we're not changing, and we don't want them to. The reality is we're not trying to make them into something they're not. And we got criticized by the left again. They said, well, some of these parents are using these scholarships to go to religious schools. Horror of horrors, that a parent could decide that they want their child to go to a Christian school, a parochial school. The union official said it best. In Louisiana, when they were opposing school choice, they said this. They said that at the end of the day, this was the best quote, the best summary. They said, parents don't have a clue when it comes to making choices for their kids. Philosophically, practically, that's what divides us from them. They really don't trust the American people. The president, people like him, the progressives think, we know better than you. We know what size soda you should be drinking. We know what kind of health insurance you should be buying. We know where your child should go to school. We know how and when you should exercise your Second Amendment rights. You should have religious liberty only in your church pew on Sunday morning, not the rest of the week. They think they know how to live our lives better than we do, and that's a fundamental, one, I don't think that's compatible with America and who we are as a country, but I think that's the fundamental difference here. We've got another program, in addition to a scholarship program, we do a dollar-for-dollar tax rebate. So if you donate to a group that helps kids go to private schools, we'll give you a dollar-for-dollar tax rebate. So if you don't want to go through the scholarship program, if you want to go that way, you have more direct control of the dollars.
It's kind of like a school tuition organization.
That's right.
Tax credit.
That's right.
Iowa has that as well. Yeah. Kind of going back, your comments about the left are, they're pushing these standards. The left's doing this and that. I hate to be in the position of defending the left, but with Common Core, I've seen Republican governors also and some conservatives defend these because they're saying, hey, we want to prepare our kids for STEM. However, a question I want to ask you, and something I want to ask other governors if I get a chance too, is if say the federal government wasn't involved in Common Core, do you believe that Common Core will actually prepare kids for STEM? Because I don't believe it does.
No, look, let me say this as a parent. Let me put on my parent hat for a second.
Sure.
I would invite any parent that has questions about Common Core, ask your kids to bring home their math. Ask them to bring home their Common Core math homework and help them do just a couple of sheets. Look, my kids are in elementary school, pick a grade level, work through this math. Just forget the theory, forget the philosophy, forget the debate. Just work through these math sheets, and then come and let's talk about, all right, is this really the best way to teach our kids? I think this is inevitable when you have a one-size-fits-all approach. I think this is inevitable. Look, I've got nothing against if there's a local school that decides on their own they want to do this curriculum, that's fine by me. Okay. What I don't want, I'm not saying you can't do it, but I'm simply saying that choice and competition are the way that we've grown our economy. It's how we as Americans believe. It's, what's ironic to me, we believe in choice and competition in almost every aspect of our lives. If the government were to come and tell us tomorrow, we're only going to let you buy one pair of jeans, we'd rebel against that. Yeah. When it comes to healthcare and education, two of the most important things in our lives, for some reason the left wants to say, well, we know choice and competition works in these other areas, we just don't want it to work in education and healthcare. The reality is this, my economy is doing very well. In Louisiana, our economy is doing very well. We need engineers. We need those STEM graduates. The reality is if we need those trained kids and those trained graduates to fill those jobs, you better know that colleges are going to be starting to produce those majors. Schools, and you know what's going to happen? Schools are going to start going out there and competing to provide the best education because parents are going to demand it. Sure. Parents are going to say, I want my little boy or girl to grow up and work in one of those new factories coming here, one of those new jobs coming here. I don't know why the left believes that if the government doesn't make us do it, that people aren't smart enough to make their own choices. And that's really what it comes down to. This is the president looking at us and saying to us, if I wasn't here, you'd buy health insurance that really wasn't good enough because you're not smart enough to buy it. This is the president again saying, if I wasn't here, or maybe this was Bloomberg, if I wasn't here, you'd be so dumb, you'd be drinking a 32-ounce soda. You need me to stop you from doing it. This is the president saying, if I wasn't here, you'd be out there shooting your guns in ways. there's just this theme. They don't trust law-abiding American citizens to exercise our rights. And the Founding Fathers, they wanted a limited government. They didn't think that government knew best. I think this is a symptom of a bigger problem. It's not just in education. It's not just in healthcare. It's not just in Second Amendment rights. It's not just in First Amendment rights. I really do think there's this progressive perspective. And, you made a very good point. We talk about big government. It's not just big government. Sometimes big business gets in this as well. We were trying to get rid of our income tax last year, and I think it's the right thing to do. What you often find out, what you sometimes discover, is that the guys with the lobbyists, the guys that are getting the special deals, the special treatment, favors from the government, they don't want change as much as government doesn't want change because they're doing pretty well. And as conservatives, we need to remember, we're not just against stuff when the other side's in charge. We need to be against abuse of government power when it's our guys in charge too. Sometimes we forget that. Republicans sometimes make that mistake thinking, well, if we're in charge, then for some reason Republican earmarks are better than Democratic earmarks, or Republican government programs. And we just got to be consistent. If it's not right for them to do it, it's not right for us to do it either.
Absolutely. Let's see. You just signed the Unsafe Abortion Protection Act. What does that do for Louisiana?
Two things. One, what literally the law does, it says that for these abortion clinics that are providing these services, their doctors have to have admitting privileges within 30 miles. So what we're saying is we're going to treat them the way we treat other outpatient surgical facilities. It's about safety and standards. Why would you want to hold them to a lower standard, quite frankly? If there are complications, they should have admitting privileges at a hospital that can help that patient. So quite literally, it does that. But secondly, there's an overall pattern, there's an overall trend in our state, and certainly we've championed this since I've been governor, of trying to pass laws that protect our unborn, innocent human life. I'm proud that year after year, for the last few years in a row, we've been ranked the most pro-life state in the country. It's a reflection of who we are, our values, our priorities. One of the other things we did, and I want to mention this because this doesn't get as much attention. This was a very important bill. I signed it in Thursday, by the way, by a Democratic author. This is a bipartisan bill. But one of the things that doesn't get as much attention, I also signed a package of bills cracking down on human trafficking. This to me is a huge, huge problem in our society, and people tend to think of it as that's happening overseas. That's happening in some third world country, or maybe it's happening in Eastern Europe, maybe it's happening in Asia. It happens in America. And it happens tragically, it's happening in Louisiana. We passed some bills helping to crack down, doing things like setting up special courts that are trained in this, providing protections to victims so they're not the ones arrested, going after the assets of those awful, awful folks that are involved in this crime so we can use those assets to help the victims, doing things like stiffening the penalties, making these guys register as sex offenders. This is not a victimless crime. It is happening in our backyard. It's a growing crime. It's one of the most profitable criminal enterprises. So as part of our initiatives to protect human life, protect our families, in Louisiana, yes, it involves the pro-life bills, but it also involves cracking down on some of these crimes like sex offenders and human traffickers. And it's something that I think that as Americans we need to be aware. Unfortunately, tragically, it's happening in a lot of our states, especially states where you have interstates, where there's a lot of folks and a lot of materials moving across state lines. Unfortunately, it's happening along those interstate corridors as well.
Great. One thing we're seeing a trend, actually. These states have passed constitutional amendments or Defense of Marriage Acts, and we have the federal judiciary just striking them down. What can states do to push back?
A couple of things. One, it does show you the importance of these November elections. We don't need this president putting more liberal judges on the bench. Some of these judges they actually admit. They actually tell you that when you listen to their speeches, when you read their writings, they sound like legislators. And they talk about taking opinion polls. And by the way, sometimes you hear it even at the Supreme Court level. We had a case in Louisiana where we were trying to put to death, we were trying to execute this awful, awful criminal who had raped a young girl, just brutally abused her. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that we couldn't do that wasn't constitutional. We couldn't do the death penalty in that type of case. But what was striking was when you sometimes read these court cases, and they say things like, well, the majority of public opinion. Well, wait a minute. Why are they taking opinion polls? I mean, they're not supposed to be, that's not their job. Or sometimes when you hear them referring international legal standards, and you think, well, wait a minute. What my understanding of their job was, they're supposed to be looking at the U.S. Constitution. What are we doing looking at? I don't really care what the United Nations says, what other countries say on these issues. We're really supposed to be looking at the Constitution and what the Founding Fathers intended. What can we do? We can make sure that a lot of times we get these bad judges and these bad cases because what happens is we have candidates that tell us one thing and then go do another.
Sure.
And we need to watch when folks are running for office. We need to be very specific to them and say, all right, now what does it mean to you? What kind of judges are you going to, if you're in a position to nominate or vote to confirm, or what kinds of judges, what's your understanding of the law? In Louisiana, we helped to start the Federalist Society chapter in Baton Rouge. We had Justice Scalia come down to the governor's residence in Baton Rouge and speak to a bunch of young attorneys. And I think it's so important that I'm not a lawyer, but whether you're a lawyer or not, to understand what it means for the courts to actually apply the Constitution as opposed for them just to create new laws or to read things and just decide they're going to contradict what the other two branches of government. We've gotten away from these three separate but equal branches of government. Instead, we've got, in many cases, these activist judges overreaching. So I think one of the things we got to do is recognize the problem for what it is. There are times where constitutional amendments can get around, but there are times where judges just throw those out as well. It's like you said, when you see with some of these marriage cases, that's why it's so important. And I came up here, you may remember we were up here after the judges overreached, and there may be times where people can actually recall some of these judges and say there are consequences.
And we do appreciate you doing the No Wiggins tour. That's...
Time for just one more, Shane.
Oh, sure. Okay, just kind of along those lines, what's your thoughts and opinion on the concept of nullification for states? Can they nullify, things of the federal government, laws or judicial decisions, things like that?
Again, I'm not an attorney. I think the best thing we can do is get conservative judicial appointments, and I think that's one of the reasons we can't have a Senate that will just rubber stamp the president's picks. Now, we are a society of laws, and we're a society that's got to recognize the Constitution laws. I think one of the reasons people are asking that question now is we've got a president who year after year after year just ignores the laws and seems to pick and choose. With Obamacare, he decided which parts of the laws he wanted to implement. You've got a president who, with the release of the 5 Taliban terrorists, decided which laws he wanted to obey, which law. And admittedly, he ignored the law. Doesn't deny the fact they ignored the laws. You've got a president who, with Fast and Furious, again, guns going to Mexican drug cartels. A president whose administration, the IRS, is going after conservatives, and who now they've, quote, lost the emails, for the last couple of years. You got a president who uses the Department of Justice to spy on the AP. It just seems to get worse and worse and worse. So I do think a lot of conservatives are considering what happens in the extreme situation when you've got an executive branch, you've got a president who's ignoring the laws, picking and choosing. It doesn't seem like anybody's holding him accountable. They even argue, the administration argues nobody's got standing to challenge them on some of these laws. Now you've got Ron Johnson challenging them in federal court, saying, how can you ignore the federal law and exempt members of Congress from living under the Obamacare Act when the federal law doesn't allow you to do that? I think we've got to be very careful before we go down that path. I think that you described in terms of nullification, I think that as a society, as a country, we're a society of rules and laws. I think that our next step needs to be, let's get more conservative judges in place. Let's get the Senate back so he can't just continue sending extreme liberal ideologues. Let's hold this president accountable. I think the next step, the next way for voters to speak out is at the ballot, let's show the president that we are a nation of laws, and we have to stand up, and we've got to obey the Constitution, obey the laws, and they apply to everybody, including the President of the United States. One of the things the Founding Fathers intended was nobody's above the law, that nobody is exempt from the law, and that includes the president, Republican, Democrat, or independent. Unfortunately, this president hasn't acted that. And here's my challenge to Democrats, by the way, as a closing thought. Here's my challenge to Democrats. I know the temptation is just to defend the president because he's their president, and they're partisan, and they're loyal, and I understand that. But they need to think about what precedent they're setting. They need to think about what happens when there's a Republican president in the White House. Are they going to stand idly by if that president decides to do some of the things this president has done? And I think they need to think very carefully about that, because that is a dangerous precedent. And even if this was a Republican president, I would say, look, it's important they need to obey the law. So our next step is, I think, in November. Let's, in the ballot box, let's remind this president that the rule of law still stands in America. And let's do that by showing at the ballot box we don't approve of what he's been doing.
Great. Thank you so much for your time.